All you do is eat and sleep, Mom. You're just wasting space. Those words echoed through my 72-year-old heart like shattered glass, cutting deeper than any physical pain I'd ever endured. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I'd share. If you also believe that we still have value, even after 60, type 1 in the comments. And please, leave a like and subscribe. Let's show that we're strong together. My name is Evelyn Martin, and I'm sitting here in my small Chicago apartment, wearing the same faded floral housecoat I've had for 15 years. The fabric is soft from countless washings, but it can't soften the hardness that's settled in my chest. The morning light filters through dusty Venetian blinds, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor where I've spent countless hours walking back and forth, waiting for phone calls that never come. The apartment smells like chamomile tea and loneliness, a combination I've grown accustomed to since Harold passed 5 years ago. His favorite chair still sits in the corner, a burgundy recliner with a permanent indent where his body once rested. Sometimes I catch myself setting 2 cups on the kitchen table out of habit, only to remember that I'll be drinking alone again. My daily routine has become a symphony of small, meaningless tasks designed to fill the endless hours. I wake at 6 a.m. sharp, old habits from decades of caring for others, and make myself a single piece of toast with butter. The kitchen is cramped, barely large enough for one person, with yellowing countertops and a refrigerator that hums too loudly. I eat standing at the counter, looking out the window at the busy street below where people rush to jobs, to families, to lives that matter. After breakfast, I water the 3 plants on my windowsill: a spider plant, a small succulent, and an African violet that refuses to bloom. These plants have become my companions, the only living things that depend on me anymore. I talk to them sometimes, telling them about the weather, about the neighbors, about anything that might fill the silence that threatens to swallow me whole. The phone sits on the coffee table like a silent judge, its black surface reflecting my hope and disappointment in equal measure. I keep it charged and close, always ready for the call from Jack that comes less and less frequently. When Harold was alive, we'd talk to Jack every Sunday evening. Now, I'm lucky if I hear from him once a month, and when I do, the conversations are brief, strained, punctuated by long pauses and the sound of him typing on his computer while I speak. Yesterday was different, though. Jack actually came to visit, and for a moment, my heart soared with the possibility that maybe, just maybe, my son missed me. I spent the morning cleaning frantically, dusting surfaces that were already spotless, rearranging the same magazines I'd been reading for months. I put on my best dress, navy blue with small white flowers, and even applied a touch of lipstick, something I hadn't done in weeks. When Jack walked through the door, I saw immediately that this wasn't a social visit. His face was set in that hard expression I'd come to dread, the one that made him look just like his father when Harold was angry about money or work stress. Jack is 45 now, tall and lean with prematurely gray hair that he keeps meticulously styled. He wore an expensive suit, charcoal gray with a blue tie, and he checked his phone constantly, as if my presence was keeping him from more important matters. "Mom, we need to talk," he said without even removing his coat. No hug, no "how are you feeling?" No acknowledgement of the effort I'd made to look presentable for his visit. He stood in my living room like a stranger, surveying the space with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating a problem that needed to be solved. I offered him coffee, tea, the leftover apple pie I'd made hoping he might stay for dinner. He declined everything with a wave of his hand, remaining standing while I settled nervously on the edge of the couch, my hands folded in my lap like a child waiting to be scolded. "I've been thinking about your situation," he began, and something in his tone made my stomach clench with dread. "You're not getting any younger, and frankly, Mom, you're not taking care of yourself the way you should. This apartment is too much for you to handle. You're isolated here and all you do is eat and sleep. You're just wasting space." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my breath catch, my chest tighten, as if the air had suddenly become too thick to breathe. Wasting space. As if my entire existence could be reduced to a calculation of square footage and utility. As if the woman who had raised him, sacrificed for him, loved him unconditionally, was nothing more than an inefficient use of real estate. I wanted to defend myself, to remind him of all the years I'd spent building his life, making his success possible. I wanted to tell him about the nights I worked double shifts as a nurse so he could have nice clothes for school, about the college fund I'd built penny by penny while denying myself even small luxuries. I wanted to remind him of the summer I gave up my vacation to pay for his baseball camp, or the Christmas I worked overtime to buy him the bicycle he'd begged for. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I sat there in my best dress, feeling smaller and more insignificant with each passing second, watching my son check his phone again as if our conversation was just another item on his to-do list that needed to be completed efficiently. "I think it's time we considered other options," he continued, his voice taking on the patronizing tone he might use with a difficult client. "There are some really nice facilities for people your age, places where you'd have company, activities, proper medical care. You wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this place anymore." The photograph on the side table caught my eye. Jack's high school graduation, both of us smiling broadly, my arm around his shoulders with such pride and love. In that picture, I was 55, still working full-time, still strong and vital and necessary. That woman believed her son would always need her, always value her, always remember the depth of her sacrifice and devotion. That woman was a fool. As Jack continued talking about facilities and better options, my mind drifted to the shoebox hidden in my bedroom closet, filled with receipts and memories that told a different story than the one he was weaving. Every piece of paper in that box represented a choice I'd made to put his needs before my own, a sacrifice he'd long forgotten, but that I carried like stones in my chest. I remembered the day in 1995 when Jack came home from high school, tears streaming down his face because he couldn't afford the class trip to Washington, D.C. All his friends were going, and he felt left out, ashamed of our modest circumstances. I was working as a night shift nurse at Chicago General, barely making ends meet since Harold's hours at the factory had been cut. My feet ached constantly from 12-hour shifts in uncomfortable shoes, and I was saving every penny for Jack's college fund. But seeing my son's face crumpled with disappointment broke something inside me. That weekend, I picked up extra shifts at a private clinic, working 36 hours straight without sleep. My supervisor warned me about burnout, about the dangers of pushing myself too hard at my age, but I smiled and assured her I was fine. I wasn't fine. My back screamed with pain, my hands shook from exhaustion, and I fell asleep standing up in the supply closet twice. When I handed Jack the $400 for his trip, wrapped in an envelope with a note that said, "Make memories, sweetheart," his face lit up with pure joy. He hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, whispering, "Thank you, Mom. You're the best," into my ear. For that moment, every aching muscle, every sleepless hour, every sacrifice felt worthwhile. He never knew that I ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner for 3 weeks to afford that trip. He never knew that I canceled my dental appointment and lived with a throbbing toothache for months because I couldn't afford both his happiness and my pain relief. He just knew that his mother had made his dream possible, and that was enough for me then. The college years were even harder. Jack had been accepted to Northwestern, a prestigious school with a tuition that made my head spin. Harold and I sat at the kitchen table with calculators and loan applications, trying to figure out how to make the impossible possible. The financial aid was minimal, and we earned just enough to disqualify us from most assistance programs, but not nearly enough to afford the costs. "Maybe I should go to community college first," Jack suggested one evening, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. All his friends were heading to 4-year universities, and I knew he felt like he was being left behind again. That night, after Jack went to bed, I made a decision that would change the trajectory of my life. I had been saving for years to open a small flower shop, a dream I'd nurtured since childhood. The money sat in a separate account, carefully accumulated through decades of denying myself small pleasures and working extra shifts. It was my escape plan, my hope for a future where I could create something beautiful instead of just surviving. I transferred every dollar to Jack's college fund. When Harold found out, he was furious. "Evelyn, that was your money, your dream. You can't just give up everything for him." But I could, and I did. I told myself that watching Jack succeed would be more fulfilling than any business I could build. I convinced myself that his happiness was my happiness, that his achievements would validate all my sacrifices. I was wrong, but I wouldn't understand that for many years. Jack thrived at Northwestern. He joined the business fraternity, made connections with wealthy classmates, and gradually became someone I barely recognized. When he came home for visits, he spoke differently, dressed differently, carried himself with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He complained about our modest house, about Harold's rough hands and simple conversation, about the way I pronounced certain words that his new friends might find unsophisticated. During his junior year, Jack needed money for a spring break trip to Europe. "All my friends are going, Mom. It's a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Plus, it's educational. We're studying international business." I was 58 then, and my body was beginning to rebel against years of physical labor and stress. The arthritis in my hands made it difficult to work long shifts, and I'd been hoping to reduce my hours. Instead, I took on a weekend job cleaning offices, scrubbing floors, and emptying trash cans in buildings where people like Jack would someday work. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was cleaning toilets to pay for my son's European vacation, but when he called from Paris, drunk on wine and freedom, telling me about the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower, I felt a strange mixture of pride and emptiness. He was living the life I'd dreamed of, experiencing the world I'd only seen in magazines. That had to be enough. After graduation, Jack moved to downtown Chicago and got a job at an investment firm. His starting salary was more than Harold and I made combined, but somehow he was always asking for money. "Just until I get established, Mom. You know how expensive it is to live in the city." I helped him with his security deposit, his first month's rent, his professional wardrobe. When he bought his first car, a sleek BMW that cost more than my annual salary, I co-signed the loan because his credit wasn't established yet. When he wanted to impress a client with dinner at an expensive restaurant, I slipped him $200 just this once. The requests became more frequent, more casual, as if my bank account was his personal emergency fund. "Mom, can you spot me $1,000? I'll pay you back next week." But next week never came, and eventually he stopped pretending he would repay me. The money I lent became gifts I was expected to give, tributes to his success that I was privileged to provide. When Jack got married to Jennifer, a lawyer from a wealthy family, I spent my entire savings account on their wedding gift, $10,000 that I'd been keeping for my own retirement. Jennifer's parents contributed $50,000, making my gift look pathetic by comparison, but I wanted to show that I supported their union, that I was worthy of inclusion in their elevated social circle. The wedding was held at an exclusive country club, where I felt like an imposter in my discount department store dress. Jennifer's mother made subtle comments about the quaint gift I'd brought, and I overheard Jack explaining to someone that I was just a nurse, as if my profession was something to be ashamed of rather than honored. Harold died 3 years later, and Jack was too busy with work to help me plan the funeral. He attended, of course, but spent most of the service checking his phone and left immediately after the burial for what he called an important client meeting. I sat alone in the funeral home's reception room, surrounded by casseroles from neighbors and coworkers, while my son prioritized his career over his father's memory. After Harold's death, the requests for money became demands. "Mom, I need you to help with the down payment on our house. Jennifer's pregnant and we need more space." It wasn't a request. It was an expectation, delivered with the assumption that of course I would liquidate my retirement funds to make their dream home possible. I gave them $30,000, nearly everything I had left. "This is for the baby," I told myself, "for my grandchild." But when little Emma was born, I was relegated to the role of occasional babysitter, useful when their regular nanny was unavailable, but otherwise kept at arm's length from the child I'd helped provide for. The pattern continued for years. Every time Jack faced a financial challenge, he turned to me, not as a son asking his mother for help, but as a creditor collecting on debt I'd never actually owed. My love became a transaction, my sacrifices became expectations, and my worth became measured solely by my ability to solve his problems with money I could barely afford to give. Now, sitting in my living room listening to him discuss my options, like I was a burden to be managed rather than a mother to be cherished, I realized that every sacrifice I'd made had led to this moment. I had trained my son to see me as a resource rather than a person, and now that my resources were depleted, I was simply in the way. Was I used? The question formed in my mind like a whisper, growing louder with each passing second. Had everything I'd given, everything I'd sacrificed, been nothing more than fuel for his ambition? Had my love been transformed into leverage, my devotion into dependence? Looking at Jack now, impatiently checking his watch as he explained why I needed to downsize my expectations, I began to suspect the answer was yes. The microaggressions started so subtly that I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. It began with Jack's tone, the way he spoke to me like I was a confused child rather than the woman who had raised him. When I called to ask about Emma's school play, his voice carried that particular brand of impatience reserved for interruptions. "Mom, I'm in a meeting. Can this wait?" he'd say, even though I could hear the television in the background and Jennifer laughing at something on her phone. My 72nd birthday passed without acknowledgement. I sat by the phone all day, watching the hands move around the clock face, telling myself that he was probably planning something special, that the call would come. By evening, I couldn't wait any longer and called him myself. "Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, but his voice lacked any real remorse. "Things have been crazy at work. Jennifer, did we miss Mom's birthday?" I heard muffled conversation in the background. Then he returned. "We'll make it up to you. Maybe dinner next week?" Next week never came. When I developed a persistent cough that lasted for months, I mentioned it during one of our increasingly rare phone calls. "You should see a doctor," Jack said dismissively. "At your age, you can't ignore these things." There was no offer to drive me to the appointment, no follow-up call to check on the results, no genuine concern in his voice, just clinical advice delivered with the emotional investment of someone reading from a medical pamphlet. The cough turned out to be pneumonia. I spent 4 days in the hospital, alone, staring at the ceiling while nurses bustled around me with professional kindness that only highlighted the absence of family care. Jack visited once, for 20 minutes, spending most of that time taking calls from work while I lay there connected to an IV, feeling like an inconvenience that had disrupted his schedule. "I'm glad you're feeling better," he said as he prepared to leave, barely glancing at me. "Jennifer sends her love." But Jennifer hadn't sent anything. Not flowers, not a card, not even a text message. The lie hung in the air between us, making my recovery feel even more hollow. Christmas became an exercise in endurance. I was invited to their house but treated like a distant relative rather than the family matriarch. I sat in the corner of their living room, surrounded by expensive furniture and elaborate decorations that my money had helped purchase, watching Emma open gifts while Jack and Jennifer exchanged meaningful glances about my condition. "Grandma Evelyn is getting older," I heard Jennifer whisper to Emma when she thought I wasn't listening. "She gets confused sometimes. Just be patient with her." Confused? I had never been more clear-headed in my life, but this was how they chose to frame my increasing withdrawal from their demands. My growing reluctance to hand over money without question. My newfound hesitation to fund their lifestyle had been rebranded as cognitive decline, a convenient explanation that allowed them to dismiss my concerns while planning my future without my input. The final birthday Emma would remember me attending was her 8th. I brought her a carefully chosen gift, a set of art supplies because she'd mentioned loving to draw, but my modest present was overshadowed by the tablet Jack and Jennifer gave her, and I watched my granddaughter's excitement deflate when she unwrapped my gift. "That's nice, Grandma," Emma said politely, but her attention had already shifted to the expensive electronics. I understood then that I couldn't compete with their resources, couldn't buy my way into their affection with gifts that seemed quaint compared to their lavish lifestyle. During that party, I overheard Jack talking to Jennifer's brother about the burden of aging parents. "Mom's getting more difficult," he said, standing near the kitchen island while I sat ignored on the living room couch. "She's becoming paranoid about money, asking too many questions about things that don't concern her. Honestly, Mike, sometimes I think she's losing it. Paranoid about money." The phrase echoed in my head as I pretended to watch Emma play with her new tablet. I had started asking questions about the loan I'd co-signed for Jack's car, about the money I'd given them for the house down payment, about the credit card Jack had added me to for emergencies that somehow always carried a balance I didn't remember creating. 3 months after that birthday party, I made a discovery that shattered what remained of my trust. I had been trying to organize my financial documents, preparing for a meeting with my accountant about my meager taxes, when I noticed something wrong with my bank statements. There were withdrawals I didn't remember making, small amounts at first, $50 here, $100 there, but they added up to thousands over the course of several months. The transactions showed my debit card being used at restaurants I'd never visited, stores I'd never shopped at, gas stations on the opposite side of the city from where I lived. My hands shook as I traced the pattern of theft with my finger. Jack had access to my account because I'd added him years ago when Harold died, thinking it would be helpful in case of emergencies. I'd trusted him completely, never imagining that he would steal from me slowly, systematically, like a parasite feeding off its host. The phone call to confront him was the hardest conversation of my life. "Jack, I need to ask you about some transactions on my account," I began, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound calm. There was a pause. "What transactions, Mom?" I read him the dates and amounts, watching my hopes for an innocent explanation crumble with each entry. Finally, he sighed like I was being unreasonable. "Mom, those were legitimate expenses. Remember when you asked me to pick up your prescriptions? And that time you needed groceries delivered? I used your card like you told me to. But I remembered no such conversations. I remembered no such permissions. And when I pressed him for details, his story kept changing, becoming more elaborate and less believable with each iteration. "Maybe your memory isn't as good as you think it is," he said finally, his voice taking on that patronizing tone I'd grown to hate. "This is exactly what Jennifer and I have been worried about. You're getting paranoid, seeing conspiracies where there aren't any." That night, I sat at my kitchen table with my bank statement spread before me like evidence in a criminal trial. Each fraudulent transaction was a small betrayal, but together they painted a picture of systematic exploitation. My own son had been stealing from me while convincing me that I was too confused to manage my own affairs. I made tea with shaking hands, the familiar ritual offering no comfort. The cup slipped from my fingers as I tried to lift it, shattering on the linoleum floor with a crash that seemed to echo through the empty apartment. I stared at the broken pieces, the brown liquid spreading across the floor, and realized it was a perfect metaphor for my life. Something inside me cracked that night. Not my heart, because that implied a clean break that might heal. This was messier, more fundamental, like the load-bearing walls of my soul finally giving way under too much weight. I had been holding up everyone else's dreams for so long that I'd forgotten I had my own foundation to maintain. For the first time in decades, I allowed myself to feel angry. Not the quick flash of irritation that came and went, but a deep, burning rage at the injustice of it all. I had given everything, my dreams, my money, my health, my dignity. And in return, I had been labeled a burden, a problem to be managed, a confused old woman whose own son felt entitled to steal from her bank account. I walked to my bedroom and stood before the mirror, really looking at myself for the first time in years. The woman staring back was thin, tired, worn down by decades of putting everyone else first. But her eyes weren't confused or paranoid. They were clear, angry, and finally ready to see the truth. I was being used. I had always been used. And now that I was no longer useful, I was being discarded with the same casual indifference Jack might show when throwing away a broken appliance. That realization should have destroyed me. Instead, it began to set me free. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 50 years. I looked at my reflection and asked myself what I wanted, not what everyone else needed from me. The answer came slowly, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. I wanted respect. I wanted dignity. I wanted to matter to someone, somewhere, for who I was, rather than what I could provide. And for the first time since Harold's death, I began to imagine a life where those things might be possible. My first act of rebellion was surprisingly simple. I changed my bank account password and removed Jack's access. The bank representative, a young woman named Sarah with kind eyes, walked me through the process with patience that felt foreign after months of being treated like an incompetent child. "Are you sure you want to remove all authorized users, Mrs. Martin?" she asked gently, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I'm absolutely certain," I replied, my voice steadier than I'd expected. For the first time in years, I felt like I was making a decision for myself, rather than reacting to someone else's demands. The phone rang that evening. I knew it would be Jack before I answered. Could almost feel his panic through the connection when his attempts to access my account had been denied. "Mom, there's something wrong with your bank account," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. I tried to pay for Emma's piano lessons like we discussed, and the card was declined. We had never discussed piano lessons. Emma had never mentioned wanting to learn piano, but I didn't challenge his lie directly. Not yet. Instead, I said simply, "I've made some changes to my account, Jack. I think it's better if I handle my own finances from now on." The silence stretched between us like a chasm. When he finally spoke, his voice had transformed into something I barely recognized: cold, calculating, dangerous. "Mom, I think you're confused. We talked about this. You asked me to help with your bills because you were having trouble keeping track of things. Remember?" The gaslighting was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost doubted myself. Almost. But the bank statements were still spread across my kitchen table, physical evidence of his betrayal that couldn't be explained away with false memories or convenient confusion. "I remember perfectly well, Jack. I remember that you've been taking money from my account without permission. I remember that you've been lying to me. And I remember that I never asked for your help. You insisted on taking control." Another pause, then a different strategy. His voice became softer, more manipulative, the tone he'd used as a child when he wanted something expensive. "Mom, you're scaring me. This paranoid thinking, these accusations, this isn't like you. Maybe we should have you see a doctor. Jennifer thinks you might be having some memory issues." Jennifer. Of course she was involved in this narrative they'd constructed about my declining mental state. I could picture them at their granite kitchen island, sharing concerned looks over their morning coffee, discussing how best to manage the problem of my increasing resistance to their financial demands. "I don't need a doctor, Jack. I need a son who treats me with respect instead of viewing me as a personal ATM." The words hung in the air, more direct than I'd been in decades. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, processing this unexpected pushback from a woman he'd grown accustomed to manipulating. "Fine," he said finally, his voice stripped of all pretense at concern. "But don't call me when you can't figure out how to pay your bills or when you need help with something. You want to be independent? Be independent." He hung up before I could respond, leaving me holding a silent phone in my empty apartment. But instead of the crushing loneliness I'd expected, I felt something unexpected: relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for his call, wasn't wondering when he'd need something from me, wasn't measuring my worth by my ability to solve his problems. The relief lasted exactly 2 days. Jennifer called on Tuesday morning, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Evelyn, I'm so worried about you. Jack told me about your phone call, and I have to say, I'm concerned about these accusations you're making. It's not like you to be so hostile." Hostile. The word was chosen carefully, designed to make me sound unstable, unreasonable, difficult. In their version of events, asking my son not to steal from me made me the problem. "I'm not being hostile, Jennifer. I'm being honest about what's been happening with my bank account." "Oh, sweetie," she said, her voice taking on that patronizing tone people use with confused elderly relatives. "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Jack was only helping you with expenses you couldn't manage on your own. Remember when you called crying because you couldn't figure out how to pay for your groceries online during the pandemic? Jack stepped in to help. I had never called crying about groceries. I had never asked for help with online payments. But Jennifer delivered these false memories with such conviction that I found myself questioning my own recollections for a moment before anger snapped me back to reality. "That never happened, Jennifer. Evelyn, honey, I'm really worried about you. This kind of confusion, these false memories, they can be signs of something serious. Maybe you should talk to someone. The conversation continued for 20 more excruciating minutes, with Jennifer alternating between fake concern and subtle threats. She mentioned how difficult it would be for me to manage alone, how worried they were about my safety, how much easier things would be if I just let them help me make decisions. When she finally hung up, I sat in my kitchen chair feeling like I'd been through a psychological war. They were good at this, Jack and Jennifer. They'd turned my legitimate complaints into evidence of mental decline, my justified anger into proof that I needed supervision. 3 days later, Emma called. My heart leaped when I saw her name on the caller ID. My granddaughter rarely contacted me directly, and I hoped this might be a genuine connection, a break from the family's united front against my newfound independence. "Hi, Grandma Evelyn," she said, but her voice sounded stilted, rehearsed. "I wanted to talk to you about something." "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" "Well, Mom and Dad are really worried about you. They said you're having trouble with your memory and that you're being mean to them. They said you won't let Dad help you anymore, and that's making everything harder for our family." The words hit me like a slap. They had weaponized my 8-year-old granddaughter, coached her to deliver guilt wrapped in innocent concern. I could picture Jennifer sitting beside her, nodding encouragingly as Emma recited the script they'd prepared. "Emma, honey, your parents and I are having a grown-up disagreement about money. It has nothing to do with you, and you don't need to worry about it. But Grandma, Dad says you think he's stealing from you, and that's not true. He would never do that. He's a good person. Maybe you just forgot that you told him he could use your card." The betrayal was complete now. They had turned my granddaughter into a messenger, filling her young mind with their version of events and sending her to convince me that my own perceptions were wrong. Emma, who should have been protected from adult conflicts, had been made into an unwitting accomplice in their manipulation. "I love you very much, Emma," I said carefully, "but this is something I need to work out with your parents directly." "Okay, Grandma, but maybe you could just say sorry to Dad? He's really sad that you don't trust him anymore. We miss seeing you at family dinners." Family dinners. As if I'd been a welcome participant rather than a tolerated obligation. As if my absence was my choice rather than the natural result of being treated like a burden who needed constant management. After Emma hung up, I walked to my bedroom and pulled out the old photo albums, looking for evidence of the loving family relationships they claimed I was destroying with my paranoid behavior. But as I flipped through the pages, I saw something I'd never noticed before. In every recent photo, I was positioned slightly apart from the group, like an add-on rather than a central figure. My smiles looked forced, tired, while Jack and Jennifer beamed with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they stood in the family hierarchy. The photos told the story I'd been too blind to see. I had been relegated to the margins of my own family long before I'd found the courage to resist their financial abuse. That evening, Jack called again. This time, his approach was different. Not angry or manipulative, but wounded, confused, playing the role of the misunderstood son whose only crime was caring too much. "Mom, I don't understand what's happening between us. I've been thinking about our conversation, and I feel like maybe I've done something to hurt you without realizing it. Can we talk about this? Can we find a way to fix our relationship?" For a moment, I almost fell for it. The tone was so reasonable, so pained, so perfectly calibrated to appeal to my maternal instincts. But then I remembered the bank statements, the lies, the years of systematic financial abuse disguised as help. "Jack, I'm willing to work on our relationship, but it has to start with honesty. I need you to acknowledge that you took money from my account without permission and that you've been lying to me about it." "Mom, I've never taken anything from you. Everything I've done has been with your permission and for your benefit. If you can't remember our conversations, that's not my fault." And there it was. The refusal to acknowledge reality, the insistence that my clear memories were wrong, the suggestion that my mental state was the problem rather than his behavior. "Then we have nothing more to discuss," I said quietly. "Fine. But don't blame me when you're sitting alone in that apartment with no one to help you. Don't blame me when you realize what you've thrown away." This time, when he hung up, I didn't feel relief. I felt something more powerful, determination. They wanted me to believe I was confused, paranoid, alone. They wanted me to think that accepting their abuse was better than facing life without their conditional love. But sitting in my quiet apartment, surrounded by the evidence of their betrayal, I realized something they hadn't counted on. I was stronger than they thought. And for the first time in years, I was angry enough to fight back. The lottery ticket had been sitting in my kitchen drawer for 3 months, forgotten beneath old grocery receipts and expired coupons. I'd bought it on impulse during one of my rare trips to the corner store, choosing numbers that held no particular significance. Harold's birthday, the day we moved to Chicago, Emma's age. $27, more than I usually spent on such frivolities, but I'd been feeling reckless that day, tired of counting every penny while my son spent my money on expensive dinners and his wife's shopping sprees. I found it while cleaning out the drawer, preparing to organize what little remained of my financial life after cutting off Jack's access to my accounts. The ticket was wrinkled and faded, and I almost threw it away before something made me pause. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe desperation, or maybe it was the universe's way of testing whether I was ready for what came next. The numbers matched. All of them. I stared at the computer screen in the library, checking and rechecking the winning numbers against my ticket, certain I was making some mistake. But there they were, identical sequences that transformed that $27 gamble into $250,000. Not enough to be featured on the evening news, but more money than I'd ever possessed at one time in my entire life. My hands shook as I tucked the ticket into my purse, looking around the library as if someone might snatch away this impossible stroke of luck. For the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Possibility. Not just the possibility of survival, but the possibility of choice, of freedom, of a life that belonged entirely to me. I didn't cash the ticket immediately. Instead, I spent 3 days researching my options, learning about taxes and financial planning with the intensity of a woman who understood that this might be her only chance to rewrite the story of her remaining years. I consulted with a financial advisor, not Jack, never Jack again, who helped me understand exactly what this windfall meant for someone in my position. After taxes and careful planning, I would have enough to live comfortably for the rest of my life without depending on anyone. Enough to travel, to rent a small house somewhere warm, to finally pursue the dreams I'd abandoned decades ago to fund other people's ambitions. Enough to never again have to choose between my dignity and my family's conditional love. The decision, when it finally crystallized, felt inevitable. I was going to disappear. Not dramatically, not with angry confrontations or tearful goodbyes, but quietly, completely, like morning mist dissipating in sunlight. I would simply remove myself from their equation, become absent from their calculations, force them to solve their problems without my checkbook and my endless capacity for self-sacrifice. I started with practical matters. A real estate agent named Marcus, a kind man in his 50s who specialized in helping seniors downsize, listened to my situation without judgment when I explained that I needed to sell my apartment quickly and quietly. "I understand completely," he said, reviewing the property details with professional efficiency. "Sometimes a fresh start is exactly what we need. I can have this listed and sold within 30 days if you're flexible on price." Flexible on price. He meant I'd take less money for a quick sale, but money was no longer my primary concern. Freedom was worth more than maximizing real estate profits. While Marcus handled the apartment sale, I researched places to live that were as far from Chicago, and from Jack, as possible. I'd always been drawn to the Southwest, to images of adobe houses and desert sunsets, to the idea of a place where winter meant mild temperatures rather than the bone-deep cold that had defined most of my adult life. I found a small rental house in Sedona, Arizona, through an online listing. The photos showed red rock formations that looked like cathedral spires and a modest single-story home with a garden full of succulents and desert flowers. The rent was reasonable, the climate was warm, and most importantly, it was 2,000 miles away from anyone who knew my name or expected anything from me. The landlord, a woman named Patricia who'd moved to Sedona after her own difficult divorce, was understanding about my situation. Sometimes we need to start over completely, she said during our phone conversation. The house is yours whenever you're ready. For the first time in decades, I made plans that had nothing to do with other people's needs or expectations. I researched flights to Phoenix, arranged for a moving company to handle my few possessions, even looked into car rental options for the drive from the airport to my new home. Every decision was mine alone, every choice made for my own benefit rather than someone else's convenience. The night before I left Chicago, I sat in my empty apartment surrounded by the boxes that contained everything I was taking with me. 47 years of marriage and motherhood reduced to a dozen cardboard containers. But instead of feeling sad about what I was leaving behind, I felt lightened, unburdened, like a tree that had finally shed the dead branches that were preventing new growth. I didn't call Jack to say goodbye. I didn't leave a forwarding address or explanation. I simply vanished from his life the same way he'd vanished from mine, gradually, quietly, without ceremony or acknowledgement. The flight to Phoenix was my first time on an airplane in 15 years. I sat by the window, watching Chicago disappear beneath clouds, feeling like I was shedding an old skin as the miles accumulated below me. The woman in the seat next to me, probably in her 60s, struck up a conversation about traveling alone. "Good for you," she said when I mentioned that I was moving to Arizona. "I didn't start traveling by myself until I was 75. Spent too many years waiting for other people to be ready to join me. Now I go wherever I want, whenever I want. It's the most liberating feeling in the world. Liberation." The word resonated in my chest as the plane descended toward Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. I was about to discover what that word truly meant. The house in Sedona exceeded my expectations. The desert landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, painted in colors I'd never seen in the Midwest. Deep oranges and purples and golds that seemed to glow with their own inner light. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of birds I couldn't identify and the whisper of wind through unfamiliar vegetation. Inside, the house was simple but comfortable. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a window that looked out onto the red rocks that had made Sedona famous. The furniture was basic but clean, and every room felt spacious after years in my cramped Chicago apartment. Most importantly, it felt peaceful. No tension in the walls, no history of conflict or disappointment, no ghosts of broken promises and unmet expectations. I spent my first week in Arizona doing absolutely nothing productive. I woke when my body felt rested, ate meals at whatever time hunger struck, sat on the back patio reading books I'd never had time for during my years of constant service to other people's needs. The luxury of purposelessness was intoxicating after decades of rigid schedules and endless obligations. Gradually, I began to explore my new surroundings. Sedona was full of people who'd come seeking transformation: artists, writers, spiritual seekers, retirees who'd decided that their remaining years should be lived on their own terms, rather than according to other people's expectations. The local coffee shop became my morning refuge, where I sat with a latte and watched tourists take photos of the impossible red rocks, while locals discussed hiking trails and art shows with the easy camaraderie of people who'd found their tribe. It was at that coffee shop that I met Eleanor, a woman about my age who'd moved to Sedona 5 years earlier after her husband's death. She had silver hair that caught the desert light, and eyes that sparkled with a vitality I'd forgotten was possible at our age. "You have the look," she said one morning, settling into the chair across from me without invitation. The look of someone who's just broken free from something that was killing her slowly. Her directness should have been off-putting, but instead it felt like recognition. Here was someone who understood transformation, who'd walked the path I was just beginning to explore. "Is it that obvious?" I asked, surprising myself with my willingness to engage with a stranger about something so personal. "Only to someone who's been there herself," Eleanor replied with a knowing smile. "I spent 35 years married to a man who convinced me that my dreams were less important than his comfort. When he died, I grieved for about 6 months, then realized I was finally free to discover who I was underneath all those years of service. We talked for 2 hours that first morning. Eleanor told me about her journey from dutiful widow to independent adventurer, about the art classes she'd started taking, the hiking group she'd joined, the pottery studio where she spent her afternoons creating beautiful, useless things just because they brought her joy. "The best part," she said as we prepared to leave, "is that nobody here knows who I used to be. I'm not defined by my past mistakes or old obligations. I'm just Eleanor, starting fresh at 71. That conversation planted a seed that grew stronger each day. In Sedona, I wasn't Jack's mother or Harold's widow, or the woman who'd sacrificed everything for a family that had ultimately discarded her. I was simply Evelyn, a woman with her own interests and opinions and possibilities. For the first time in my adult life, I began to sleep through the night. No more lying awake, worrying about other people's problems. No more jumping at every phone ring. No more calculating whether I could afford to help with the latest family crisis. The peace was so profound, it almost felt foreign, like wearing clothes that had been tailored specifically for my body after years of hand-me-downs that never quite fit. 3 weeks into my new life, I did something I hadn't done in over 20 years. I bought something expensive just because I wanted it. It was an easel and a set of oil paints from the local art supply store, materials for pursuing a hobby I'd abandoned when Jack was born and never had time to resurrect. The young woman at the store, probably Emma's age, helped me select brushes and canvases with enthusiasm that reminded me what it felt like to have someone genuinely interested in helping, rather than simply tolerating my presence. "Are you just starting out?" she asked as she rang up my purchases. "Actually, I'm starting over," I corrected her, and the distinction felt important. Starting over implied choice, intentionality, hope. It suggested that my best years might still be ahead of me rather than behind me. That evening, I set up the easel on my back patio and attempted to capture the sunset that painted the red rocks in impossible shades of gold and purple. My technique was rusty, my hands uncertain, but the act of creation felt like coming back to life after a long, dreamless sleep. As I painted, I thought about Jack and Jennifer and Emma, probably sitting around their granite kitchen island, discussing my disappearance with the same clinical detachment they'd once used to plan my future. I wondered if they missed me, or if they simply missed my checkbook. I wondered if Emma asked about her grandmother, or if my absence had been explained away as easily as my presence had been dismissed. But for the first time, these thoughts didn't bring the sharp pain of loss. Instead, they felt like echoes from someone else's life, problems that belonged to a woman I used to be but would never be again. The paint on my canvas was still wet, the colors blending in ways I hadn't intended, but that somehow captured exactly what I was feeling. Transformation, renewal, the beautiful messiness of starting over when you thought it was too late for new beginnings. Tomorrow, I would wake up in my own house, in my own time, with my own plans that served no one's interests but my own. And for the first time in decades, that felt like enough. 2 months into my new life in Sedona, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. I'd grown protective of my peace, reluctant to let the outside world intrude on the sanctuary I'd built. But something made me pick up, perhaps curiosity about who might have tracked down my new number. Mom, is that you?" Jack's voice crackled through the connection, tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. Panic? Anger? Desperation? I sat in silence for a moment, watching a roadrunner dart across my backyard while my son's voice pulled me back toward a life I'd worked so hard to leave behind. "Yes, Jack, it's me." "Jesus Christ, Mom! Where the hell are you? We've been looking for you for weeks. I went to your apartment and found it empty. No forwarding address. Nothing. The neighbors said you just disappeared. I thought you were dead." The concern in his voice might have fooled the old Evelyn, the woman who'd spent decades interpreting any attention from her son as love, even when it came wrapped in accusations and demands. But 2 months of peace had given me clarity, and I could hear what lay beneath his panic. Not grief for a missing mother, but fury at a resource that had suddenly become unavailable. "I moved, Jack. People do that sometimes." "Moved where? And why didn't you tell us? Do you have any idea what you've put us through? Emma's been asking about you constantly, and I've had to make excuses because I didn't know where you were or if you were even alive." Emma asking about me. The mention of my granddaughter still had the power to twist something in my chest, but I'd learned to question everything Jack said, to look for the manipulation hidden inside apparent concern. When did Emma start asking about me? I asked quietly. Because she hadn't called or visited in months before I left. Silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of Jack's breathing and the distant hum of traffic from whatever location he was calling from. That's not the point, Mom. The point is that you disappeared without a word, leaving us to worry about you. That's not normal behavior. That's not something a responsible person does to their family. There it was, the subtle shift from concern to criticism, the implication that my actions were evidence of the mental decline they'd been suggesting for months. In Jack's version of reality, a mother who vanished without trace was irresponsible, but a son who stole from that mother's bank account was just being helpful. I left because I needed to get away from people who were treating me badly, I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. I left because I realized that staying was killing me slowly. Treating you badly? Mom, what are you talking about? We were trying to help you. You were having problems managing your finances, forgetting conversations, getting paranoid about things that weren't real. We were worried about you. The gaslighting was as smooth as ever, delivered with the practiced ease of someone who'd been refining these techniques for years. But distance had given me perspective, and I could see the pattern clearly now, how they'd reframed every instance of my resistance as evidence of incompetence, every justified complaint as proof of paranoia. Jack, I want you to listen to me very carefully, I said, standing up and walking to the window where I could see the red rocks that had become my daily reminder of freedom. I was not confused. I was not paranoid. I was not having memory problems. You were stealing money from my account, and when I confronted you about it, you tried to convince me that I was losing my mind. That's not true, Mom. You asked me to help with your bills because you were having trouble keeping track of things. Everything I did was with your permission. Then explain the restaurant charges in downtown Chicago when I never left my apartment. Explain the gas station purchases on the other side of the city. Explain the shopping trips to stores I've never heard of. Another pause. Longer this time. When Jack spoke again, his voice had changed, becoming colder, more calculated. Where are you, Mom? I'm coming to get you. Clearly you're not thinking straight, and you shouldn't be making major decisions on your own. We need to get you evaluated by a professional. The threat was clear, disguised as concern, but unmistakably intended to strip away the autonomy I'd fought so hard to reclaim. He would have me declared incompetent, take control of my finances again, lock me away in some facility where I could be managed more efficiently. I'm not telling you where I am, Jack, and I'm not coming back. Mom, be reasonable. You can't just run away from your problems. You have responsibilities here. Emma needs her grandmother. Emma has never needed me. She's been taught to see me as an embarrassment, a burden, a confused old woman who doesn't understand the real world, just like you taught her. That's not true. We love you, Mom. We miss you. But this behavior, this running away and making wild accusations, it's not normal. Let us help you. Help. The word had lost all meaning coming from Jack's mouth. His version of help involved stealing my money, controlling my decisions, and slowly erasing my identity until I became nothing more than a problem to be managed. I don't need your help, Jack. I'm doing fine on my own. Fine? You're living God knows where, probably spending money you can't afford, making decisions without considering the consequences. That's not fine, Mom. That's concerning. I almost laughed at the irony. For months, he'd been concerned about my ability to manage money while systematically draining my accounts. Now he was worried about my spending while having no idea that I was more financially secure than I'd ever been in my life. My finances are none of your business anymore, Jack. Of course they're my business. I'm your son. I'm supposed to look out for you, especially when you're not capable of looking out for yourself. And there it was, the fundamental assumption that had driven our relationship for years. In Jack's mind, I was inherently incapable, permanently childlike, forever in need of his superior judgment and guidance. My age had become evidence of incompetence, my gender proof of helplessness, my love for him justification for his control over my life. I'm 72 years old, Jack, not 7. I'm perfectly capable of making my own decisions. Are you? Because running away without telling anyone where you're going doesn't seem like a rational decision to me? The The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, Jack alternating between fake concern and barely veiled threats, trying every manipulation technique in his arsenal to convince me to reveal my location and return to my role as his personal financial resource. He mentioned Emma's sadness, Jennifer's worry, the difficulty of explaining my absence to their friends and neighbors. But something had changed in me during those 2 months in the desert. The constant anxiety that had been my companion for years had evaporated, replaced by a calm certainty about my own worth and capabilities. I was no longer the desperate woman who would sacrifice anything to maintain the illusion of family connection. "Jack," I said finally, interrupting his latest plea for me to come home and work things out, "I want you to understand something. I spent 50 years putting other people's needs before my own. I gave you everything I had, my money, my time, my dreams, my health, my dignity. And in return, you treated me like a burden, stole from me, and tried to convince me that I was losing my mind. Mom, I'm not finished. I'm finally living the life I want to live, in a place where people treat me with respect, doing things that bring me joy instead of just serving other people's needs. I'm not coming back to that old life. I'm not going back to being someone you can use and discard when it's convenient." The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses. This one felt final, like the moment when a door closes and the lock clicks into place. "Fine," Jack said eventually, his voice stripped of all pretense at affection. "But don't expect us to be here when you change your mind. Don't expect us to welcome you back when you realize what you've thrown away. You're on your own now, Mom. I hope it was worth it." The line went dead, leaving me holding a silent phone in my sun-filled living room. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, painted in shades of gold and orange by the late afternoon light. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals with effortless grace. For the first time in our relationship, Jack had been completely honest with me. The mask of filial duty had slipped, revealing the transactional nature of what I'd mistaken for love. In his mind, I'd thrown away something valuable. Not our relationship, but my usefulness to him, my willingness to fund his lifestyle without asking uncomfortable questions. I should have felt devastated by his final rejection, crushed by the loss of the family connections I'd spent my entire adult life building and maintaining. Instead, I felt lighter, as if a weight I'd been carrying for so long I'd forgotten it was there had finally been lifted from my shoulders. I was on my own now, just as Jack had threatened, and for the first time in my life, that felt like a promise rather than a punishment. 6 months after Jack's final phone call, I stood before my easel watching the sunrise paint the red rocks in shades of fire and gold, my hands steady as I mixed colors that had no names in any language I knew. The woman who had once trembled at the thought of disappointing her son now wielded a paintbrush with the confidence of someone who had finally learned to trust her own vision. My paintings had evolved from tentative attempts to capture the landscape into bold expressions of freedom that surprised even me. Eleanor, who had become my closest friend and artistic mentor, said they contained something she called liberation energy, the visual representation of a soul that had broken free from decades of constraint. "You're painting like a woman who's just remembered she has wings," she told me one morning as we set up our easels in Cathedral Rock's shadow. "There's joy in every brushstroke now, even when you're working with darker colors." The local art gallery had started displaying my work in their Emerging Artists section, a label that made me laugh every time I saw it. Emerging at 72, like a butterfly that had spent most of its life believing it was meant to remain a caterpillar. 3 of my paintings had sold to tourists who connected with what the gallery owner called my Authentic Desert Transformation series. The money from those sales was inconsequential compared to my lottery winnings, but the validation was priceless. Someone, somewhere, had found my work worthy of hanging in their home, worthy of living with daily. After decades of feeling invisible and unnecessary, I was creating things that mattered to strangers who knew nothing about my past struggles or family disappointments. My days had developed a rhythm that belonged entirely to me. Morning coffee on the patio while watching the desert wake up, followed by a walk along the hiking trails that wound through the red rocks. The physical activity had strengthened muscles I'd forgotten I possessed, and cleared my mind in ways that years of anxiety medication had never achieved. I'd joined a hiking group for seniors, led by a 78-year-old former park ranger named Walt, who treated our weekly adventures like military expeditions. Under his guidance, I discovered that my body was capable of far more than I'd believed possible. The woman who had once felt exhausted by a trip to the grocery store now climbed rocky trails with the determination of someone making up for lost time. The desert teaches you things about yourself, Walt explained during one of our more challenging hikes to Devil's Bridge. It strips away everything unnecessary and shows you what you're really made of. Most people are stronger than they think. They just never get the chance to find out. I had found out. My legs carried me up steep inclines without complaint. My lungs adapted to the thin air and physical demands I hadn't placed on them in decades. My spirit, freed from the constant weight of other people's expectations, soared as high as the red-tailed hawks that circled overhead. The social connections I'd built in Sedona were unlike any relationships I'd experienced in Chicago. Here, friendships formed around shared interests rather than family obligations or geographical convenience. The pottery class I'd joined introduced me to women who'd come to the desert seeking their own versions of transformation: a retired teacher who'd started sculpting after her husband's death, a former corporate executive who'd discovered the meditative qualities of working with clay, a widow who'd traded her empty house in Ohio for a small apartment and unlimited creative possibilities. We met twice a week at a studio downtown, our hands deep in red clay that seemed to absorb all the negative energy we'd carried from our previous lives. My pottery was terrible at first: lopsided bowls and asymmetrical vases that collapsed under their own weight. But improvement came with practice. And more importantly, the process itself was healing in ways I couldn't articulate. "There's something about creating with your hands," explained Sarah, the studio owner and our patient instructor, "that reconnects you with parts of yourself that get buried under years of taking care of everyone else. When you're working with clay, you can't think about anything but the present moment. It's meditation disguised as art." She was right. At the pottery wheel, there was no room for regret about the past or anxiety about the future. There was only the clay, my hands, and the possibility of creating something beautiful from formless earth. The metaphor wasn't lost on me. I was doing the same thing with my life, reshaping the raw material of my remaining years into something that served my own vision rather than someone else's expectations. The transformation wasn't just artistic or physical. For the first time in my adult life, I had disposable income that I could spend on things that brought me pleasure rather than solving other people's problems. I bought books without checking the price, ate dinner at restaurants because I enjoyed the food rather than because someone else was hungry, replaced my threadbare wardrobe with clothes that made me feel attractive and confident. The woman who stared back at me from mirrors now bore little resemblance to the defeated person who'd fled Chicago 6 months earlier. Desert sun had put color in my cheeks. Physical activity had straightened my posture, and the absence of constant stress had erased years from my face. More importantly, my eyes held something they'd been missing for decades: hope. I'd also started writing, not anything ambitious, just daily reflections in a journal that Eleanor had given me for my 73rd birthday. The entries began as simple records of my activities and gradually evolved into deeper explorations of my thoughts and feelings about the life I'd left behind and the one I was building. Reading back through those early entries, I could trace my emotional evolution from the angry, hurt woman who'd initially fled her family to someone who was beginning to understand that their rejection was actually a gift. They'd freed me from the exhausting work of trying to earn love from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I spent 50 years believing that love meant sacrifice, I wrote one evening after a particularly satisfying day of painting. I thought that the more I gave up for other people, the more valuable I became to them. But I had it backwards. The more I sacrificed, the less they respected me. The more I enabled their selfishness, the more selfish they became. I wasn't buying their love. I was teaching them that I didn't deserve it. The insight was liberating and heartbreaking in equal measure. I grieved for all the years I'd wasted, all the dreams I'd abandoned, all the times I'd chosen someone else's comfort over my own dignity. But I also felt grateful for the lottery ticket that had made my escape possible, for the courage that had finally surfaced when I needed it most, for the discovery that it was never too late to become the person you were meant to be. My neighbors in Sedona had become the family I'd never had, people who valued my company for its own sake, rather than for what I could provide. Margaret, who lived next door, brought me vegetables from her garden and stayed for coffee that stretched into hours of conversation about books and travel and the peculiar freedom that came with surviving long enough to stop caring what other people thought. Tom, the widower across the street, had become my hiking companion and occasional dinner partner. Our relationship was comfortable and uncomplicated. Two people who enjoyed each other's company without the need to define or complicate what that meant. He made me laugh with stories from his 40-year career as a high school principal, and I cooked meals that reminded us both that food tasted better when shared with someone who appreciated the effort involved. None of these people knew about Jack or Jennifer or Emma. They knew me only as Evelyn, the woman who painted landscapes that captured something essential about the desert spirit, who brought homemade cookies to community events, who could be counted on to help with neighborhood projects without expecting anything in return, except the satisfaction of contributing to something positive. In Chicago, I'd been defined by my relationships to other people: Jack's mother, Harold's widow, Emma's grandmother. In Sedona, I was simply myself, valued for my own qualities rather than my usefulness to others. The difference was profound and healing in ways I was still discovering. One evening, as I sat on my patio watching stars emerge in the vast desert sky, I realized that I no longer thought about Jack and Jennifer and Emma with the sharp pain that had once accompanied every memory. The hurt had faded into something more like sadness, not for my loss, but for theirs. They would never know the woman I'd become because they'd been too busy managing the woman they'd wanted me to remain. Emma would grow up with only distant memories of a grandmother who'd seemed tired and sad, who'd disappeared mysteriously when she was 8 years old. She would never know about the paintings or the pottery or the hiking adventures. She would never see the photos from my art show opening or read the journal entries about discovering joy in simple pleasures. But their loss was no longer my burden to carry. I had chosen freedom over family obligation, dignity over conditional love, authentic happiness over the performance of contentment. For the first time in my adult life, I was living for myself, and it felt like waking up after decades of sleepwalking through someone else's dream. The desert had taught me that some plants thrive only when transplanted to new soil, that roots can grow deeper when freed from competition for resources, that flowering sometimes requires leaving behind everything familiar and starting fresh in unfamiliar ground. I was blooming in the desert, finally and completely myself. 3 years have passed since I left Chicago, and today I'm sitting on the porch of my own small house. Yes, I bought it with the money from selling 3 dozen paintings and prudent investments from my lottery winnings, watching my neighbor's granddaughter practice painting techniques I taught her last summer. Maria is 9 years old, the same age Emma would be now. But unlike my biological granddaughter, she sees me as someone worth learning from rather than someone to tolerate out of obligation. "Mrs. Evelyn, the sunset colors are changing too fast," Maria calls out, her brush hovering uncertainly over her canvas. "How do I catch them before they disappear?" "You don't catch them, sweetheart," I reply, walking over to examine her work. "You paint what they make you feel, not what they look like. The light will change, but the feeling stays with you." She nods seriously, returning to her canvas with the intensity that only children bring to activities they love. Watching her, I'm reminded of something I'd forgotten during all those years of serving other people's needs. The pure joy of teaching someone who actually wants to learn, of sharing knowledge with someone who values what you have to offer. The irony isn't lost on me that I've become the grandmother I always wanted to be, patient, encouraging, full of stories and skills worth sharing, to a child who isn't related to me by blood. Maria's parents, recent immigrants from Mexico, treat me with a respect and affection that my own family never managed to show. When Maria brings me her drawings, her face glowing with pride, I see reflected back the value I'd forgotten I possessed. Last month, I received an unexpected letter. Not from Jack, we haven't spoken since that final phone call 3 years ago, but from Emma's school. Apparently, she'd written an essay about family members for a class assignment and had included a paragraph about her missing grandmother, who had taught her to appreciate art during their brief visits together. The letter, forwarded through several address changes, contained a copy of Emma's essay. In it, she wrote, "My grandmother Evelyn disappeared when I was 8. I don't understand why she left, but I remember that she always smelled like flowers and had gentle hands. She showed me how to look at paintings in museums and said that art was about feeling things, not just seeing them. I hope she's happy wherever she is now, because she seemed sad when she lived near us." I cried when I read those words, not from regret, but from a bittersweet recognition that some seeds take years to germinate. Emma had absorbed more from our limited time together than I'd realized, and somewhere in Chicago, an 11-year-old girl was learning to see beauty in ways I'd taught her, even if she didn't fully understand the lesson yet. I wrote back to the school, asking them to forward a letter to Emma. I didn't reveal my location or contact information, but I told her about my paintings, about the desert sunsets that reminded me of her curiosity about colors, about how proud I was that she'd chosen to write about me in her school assignment. I enclosed a small watercolor sketch of a roadrunner, her favorite bird from nature documentaries we'd watched together, with a note that said simply, "Keep looking for beauty, sweetheart. It's everywhere when you know how to see it." Whether she'll ever receive that letter, whether Jack and Jennifer will allow her to read it, I may never know. But the act of writing it felt like closing a circle, like offering forgiveness not because it was deserved, but because carrying resentment was too heavy a burden for the life I was building. The truth is, I rarely think about my old life anymore. The woman who spent sleepless nights worrying about Jack's finances, who measured her worth by her family's approval, who believed that love required endless sacrifice. That woman feels like someone I used to know, rather than someone I used to be. My days are full in ways I never imagined possible. This morning, I led a painting workshop for senior citizens at the community center, watching 12 women over 60 discover that they had artistic abilities they'd never explored. This afternoon, I'll finish a commissioned piece for a couple who fell in love with my work at last month's gallery showing. Tonight, I'm having dinner with Tom and his visiting daughter, who has become a friend in her own right and always asks to see my latest paintings when she comes to town. Next week, I'm flying to Santa Fe for an art exhibition featuring late-blooming artists, painters who didn't begin their serious work until after age 70. My piece, Liberation at Sunset, will hang beside works by women who, like me, discovered that the end of traditional obligations could mark the beginning of authentic self-expression. The painting shows a figure walking away from a shadowy house toward a landscape painted in brilliant oranges and purples, arms outstretched as if embracing the sky itself. The gallery curator called it a visual manifesto of personal freedom, but to me, it's simply an honest representation of the moment I chose myself over everyone else's expectations. I've also been asked to speak at a conference for women going through late-life transitions, divorce, widowhood, empty nest syndrome, caring for aging parents who then pass away. The organizers want me to share my story of reinvention, to offer hope to women who feel like their useful years are behind them. What would you tell a 70-year-old woman who feels invisible? The conference coordinator asked during our planning call. I'd tell her that invisible can be a superpower if you use it right, I replied. When people stop expecting things from you, you're finally free to become who you actually are. The speaking engagement terrifies and excites me in equal measure. For decades, I believed my value lay in my ability to remain in the background, to support others without drawing attention to myself. The idea of standing before an audience, sharing my story as if it mattered, as if other people might benefit from hearing about my journey, it still feels revolutionary. But that's exactly why I need to do it. Women my age are constantly told that our stories don't matter, that our experiences are outdated, that our wisdom is irrelevant in a world that worships youth and novelty. We're expected to gracefully fade into the background, to become grateful recipients of younger people's decisions about our lives, to accept diminishment as the natural price of aging. I refuse to accept that narrative, and my refusal saved my life. The woman who fled Chicago 3 years ago was drowning in other people's expectations, suffocating under the weight of relationships that took everything and gave nothing back. She believed that being needed was the same as being loved, that sacrifice was the currency of family connection, that her worth was measured by her willingness to disappear into other people's lives. That woman was wrong about almost everything, but she was right about one crucial thing. It's never too late to start over. It's never too late to choose dignity over convenience, authenticity over approval, self-respect over family harmony that exists only when you're willing to accept disrespect. My lottery winnings made my escape possible, but the real treasure wasn't the money. It was the discovery that I was strong enough to use it wisely, brave enough to leave everything familiar, creative enough to build a life that reflected my actual values rather than other people's expectations. Not everyone who needs to leave will have a lottery ticket, but everyone has something. Skills, experience, resilience, the capacity to make different choices than the ones they've been making. Everyone has the right to demand respect, to say no to relationships that diminish them, to prioritize their own well-being without apology or explanation. The desert taught me that some plants need harsh conditions to reveal their true nature, that roots grow deeper when they have to work for survival, that the most beautiful flowers often bloom in the most unlikely places. I was a late-blooming desert flower myself, tough enough to survive transplanting, resilient enough to thrive in unfamiliar soil, beautiful in ways I'd never had the chance to discover while living in someone else's shadow. As I watch Maria add final touches to her sunset painting, I think about the ripple effects of choosing courage over comfort. This child will grow up knowing that art matters, that older women have valuable skills to share, that respect flows both ways regardless of age. She'll remember that her neighbor Evelyn treated her paintings as seriously as any adult artist's work, that creativity doesn't have expiration dates, that it's possible to reinvent yourself at any stage of life. These are gifts I could never have given Emma while trapped in the role of convenient grandmother, available for babysitting but not consulted about decisions, tolerated at family gatherings, but not truly welcomed. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is remove yourself from relationships that prevent you from being your best self, that teach others to see you as less than you are, that drain your energy without offering anything meaningful in return. The sun is setting now, painting the red rocks in shades of gold that make Maria gasp with delight. She's captured something essential in her painting, not the literal colors, but the feeling of standing witness to daily beauty, of being present for the world's ongoing masterpiece. "Mrs. Evelyn," she says, stepping back to evaluate her work, "do you think my painting is good enough?" "Maria," I tell her, pulling my sweater closer as the desert air begins to cool, "your painting is exactly what it needs to be, just like you, just like me, just like everyone who has the courage to create something true." She beams at me with the uncomplicated joy of a child who feels seen and valued, then runs across the yard to show her parents what she's accomplished. I remain on my porch, watching the last light fade behind the mountains, grateful beyond words for the choices that brought me to this moment. Have you ever felt invisible in your own life? Have you ever loved someone who couldn't see your worth? Have you ever wondered if it's too late to choose yourself? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if this message resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Sometimes we all need reminding that our stories matter, that our worth isn't determined by other people's ability to recognize it, and that the best chapters of our lives might still be waiting to be written.